He's late, disheveled, soaking wet, and you expect me to hire someone who can't even show up on time? The silence in the sleek conference room was deafening. Eyes turned toward the drenched young man standing by the elevator, his portfolio ruined, his future slipping. Just then the heavy doors opened behind them. A calm, authoritative voice interrupted the tension. He's late because he was helping me, and I suggest you hear him out. Every head turned. It was Edward Granger, the founder and CEO. What no one knew was that the morning's rainstorm had changed both their lives forever. Marco Santos had always been good at mathematics. Numbers spoke to him in ways that words sometimes couldn't. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Manila, he'd spend hours solving problems while other children played in the streets. His father, a high school mathematics teacher, had nurtured this talent from an early age, staying up late to teach him concepts far beyond his years. "You have a gift, anak," his father would tell him. "But remember, intelligence without kindness is like a knife without a handle. It cuts the one who holds it." At 26, Marco carried these lessons across. Oceans. Chicago's skyline was a far cry from Manila's chaotic beauty, but he was determined to make it his home, at least for now. With a master's degree in financial mathematics from the University of the Philippines and 3 years of experience at a respectable firm in Manila, Marco had come to America on a specialized work visa, hoping to gain international experience before returning home to start his own consulting business. 6 months in, and the reality was harsher than he'd anticipated. His savings were dwindling, his visa clock was ticking, and the prestigious positions he'd dreamed of remained elusive. American firms valued American experience, creating the familiar immigrant's paradox. He needed a job to get experience, but needed experience to get a job. Then came the email. That changed everything. "We are pleased to inform you that your application for the financial analyst position at Granger & Wells Capital has been selected for an interview." Marco read it 17 times. Granger & Wells was no ordinary firm. It was a financial titan, known for its innovative investment strategies and selective hiring process. Rumor had it that they hired less than 2% of applicants. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, checking the sender's address for signs of fraud. But the email was legitimate, bearing the firm's distinctive logo and proper contact information. That night, Marco called his parents in Manila, despite the 13-hour time difference. "Ma, Pa, I got an interview at Granger & Wells," he said, his voice barely containing his excitement. "Anak, that's wonderful news," his mother exclaimed. "Your father is still at school, but he'll be so proud." "I don't know if I'm ready, Ma," Marco confessed. "These are the best financial minds in the country." His mother's voice softened. "Marco, listen to me. You didn't cross oceans to doubt yourself now. Your father and I didn't work extra jobs for your education so you could hide your light. You belong in that room." For the next 2 weeks, Marco prepared obsessively. He analyzed the firm's public portfolio, memorized their recent transactions, and researched every executive he might encounter. He practiced answers in front of his bathroom mirror, trimmed his hair twice, and spent a third of his remaining funds on a new suit. Dark blue, classic cut, perfect for making a strong first impression. The day before the interview, Marco received a call from his landlord. The ceiling in his bathroom had begun to leak, and the repair would cost more than he could afford. For hours, he battled with buckets and towels, trying to contain the damage while reviewing interview questions in his head. By midnight, the leak had worsened, and water was seeping into the hallway. Marco called the emergency maintenance number, but no one answered. Exhausted and stressed, he finally fell asleep at 3 a.m., surrounded by spreadsheets and financial reports. The morning arrived with a torrential downpour that seemed to mock his predicament. Marco woke with a jolt, realizing his alarm hadn't gone off. The power in his building had failed during the night. It was 7:48 a.m. His interview was at 9 a.m. and Granger & Wells was downtown, at least 40 minutes away in good weather. No, Marco muttered, scrambling out of bed. He showered in cold water, threw on his new suit, and grabbed his portfolio, a leather binder containing his resume, certificates, and sample analyses. The rain hammered against his windows as he quickly made himself presentable, foregoing breakfast. At 8:15 a.m., Marco rushed out the door. The streets had transformed into shallow rivers, and the usual bus stop was crowded with people seeking shelter. When the bus finally arrived, it was packed to capacity. and the driver shook his head apologetically as he passed by without stopping. Marco checked his phone. 8:27 a.m. His heart pounded as he opened his rideshare app, only to find that prices had surged to 3 times the normal rate due to the weather. He bit his lip and booked it anyway. This interview was worth the expense. The confirmation came through. Driver arriving in 12 minutes. 8 minutes later, the driver cancelled. Marco stood under a store awning, watching the minutes tick by. He tried hailing taxis, but they sped past, already occupied. He attempted to book another ride, but the estimated arrival times kept increasing. At 8:45 a.m., with desperation mounting, Marco made a decision. He would run. It was crazy, but it was his only option. Tucking his portfolio inside his jacket to protect it from the rain, he set off at a sprint through the downpour. Water splashed up his pant legs with every step. His carefully polished shoes became waterlogged. Cars honked as he darted. Across intersections, narrowly avoiding puddles that could have been ankle-deep or worse. By the time the gleaming Granger Tower came into view, Marco was soaked to the skin. His perfectly pressed suit clung to him, his hair plastered to his forehead. But he had made it, or almost. The building's clock showed 8:58 a.m. With his heart in his throat, Marco pushed through the revolving door into the grand lobby, where security guards eyed him with suspicion. He fumbled for his ID and interview invitation, his hands trembling from cold and anxiety. "I have an interview," he gasped. "9th floor, Granger and Wells." The guard scanned his documents and nodded toward the elevators. "Sign here, you'll need a visitor badge." As Marco waited for the elevator, he caught his reflection in the polished metal doors. He barely recognized himself, drenched, disheveled, a far cry from the polished professional he had practiced being. He tried to smooth his hair, straighten his tie, but it was futile. The portfolio he had so carefully prepared was damp at the edges despite his efforts to protect it. The elevator arrived and Marco stepped in, pressing the button for the 9th floor. As the doors closed, he took a deep breath, trying to center himself. "Just be honest," he whispered, recalling his father's words. "Be yourself. That's all anyone can really ask." The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying Marco toward a moment that would alter the course of his life, though not in the way he could possibly imagine. Edward Granger did not believe in luck. At 68, he had built an empire, on calculated risks and meticulous planning. Luck, he often told his executives, was simply the intersection of preparation and opportunity. But on this particular morning, as his silver Bentley sputtered to a halt on Lower Wacker Drive, he wondered if perhaps he had tempted fate by dismissing it so thoroughly. The rain fell in sheets, transforming Chicago's concrete underbelly into a glistening, otherworldly cave. Edward had been on his way to a quarterly board meeting, one he himself had scheduled at the unusually early hour of 8:30 a.m. to accommodate a trustee's travel plans. Now, with a flat tire and no driver, he had insisted on driving himself that morning, a small rebellion against the trappings of success that sometimes felt suffocating. He was stranded. Edward popped the trunk and retrieved the spare tire and jack, grimacing at the thought of ruining his bespoke suit. He had changed countless tires in his youth, but that was decades ago, when his hands were stronger and his knees more forgiving. Still, pride prevented him from immediately calling for help. He would try at least. The rain intensified as Edward knelt beside the car, struggling with the jack. Water trickled down his neck despite the shelter of the overpass. His fingers, once nimble with numbers and negotiations, fumbled with the unfamiliar equipment. After 10 frustrating minutes, he was soaked. His hands were smeared with grease, and the tire remained stubbornly in place. Edward checked his watch, 8:15 a.m. The board would be assembling now, wondering where he was. Sophie, his assistant, would be calling his cell phone, which he had left charging in the car. He was considering admitting defeat when he noticed a young man running through the downpour. The young man was dressed in a suit, clutching something protectively inside his jacket. He was clearly late for something important, his face a mask of determination as he battled the elements. For a moment, their eyes met across the rain-swept space, and Edward saw the brief calculation in the younger man's expression, the hesitation, the glance at his watch, the internal debate. To Edward's surprise, the young man changed course, jogging toward the stranded Bentley. "Sir, do you need help?" he asked, his accent revealing hints of Southeast Asia. "I'm afraid I do," Edward admitted, gesturing to the flat tire. "Though I hate to delay you. You seem to be in a hurry." The young man glanced at his watch again, 8:17 a.m. "I have an interview," he said, "but this won't take long if we work together." Without waiting for a response, he removed his jacket, carefully placed his portfolio on a relatively dry spot beneath the car, and rolled up his sleeves. Edward watched as the young man efficiently positioned the jack, his movements quick and precise despite the rain that plastered his white shirt to his skin. "I'm Marco," he said as he worked. "Marco Santos." "Edward," the older man replied, deliberately omitting his last name. There was something refreshing about being seen as just another person in need, rather than the financial magnate whose name adorned the building 20 blocks away. Together, they removed the flat tire and installed the spare. Marco's hands were steady, his instructions clear and respectful. He didn't seem to mind the rain or the grease or the delay to his own schedule. When the job was finished, Edward offered his handkerchief for Marco to wipe his hands. "Thank you, Marco. You've saved an old man considerable embarrassment." Marco smiled, revealing a warmth that transcended the dreary morning. "My father always says that kindness costs nothing but means everything. Your father is a wise man." Edward glanced at his watch, 8:41 a.m. "Your interview. Will you still make it?" Marco's smile faltered. I hope so. It's at Granger and Wells Capital. It's very important to me." A curious coincidence fluttered through Edward's mind, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's quite a prestigious firm. What position are you interviewing for?" "Financial analyst," Marco replied, retrieving his portfolio, which had stayed relatively dry. "It's my dream job, actually. They're doing incredible work in emerging markets, especially in Southeast Asia, which is where I'm from, the Philippines." Edward nodded, his interest genuinely piqued. "And what makes you qualified for such a position?" For a moment Marco stood taller, his professional confidence shining through his bedraggled appearance. "I have a master's in financial mathematics and 3 years of experience with Rizal Banking Corporation in Manila. I've developed models for microfinance initiatives that increased lending efficiency by 22% while reducing default rates. I believe financial institutions have a responsibility to—" He caught himself, suddenly aware that he was delivering his interview pitch to a stranger in the rain. "I'm sorry," he said with an embarrassed laugh. "I've been practicing that answer for weeks." Edward smiled. "Never apologize for passion, Marco. It's the one thing that can't be taught or bought." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, hesitating before handing it over. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call." Marco accepted the card with both hands, a gesture of respect that Edward recognized from his dealings in Asia. The young man tucked it away without looking at it, his mind clearly already racing ahead to his interview. "I should go," Marco said, checking his watch again, 8:47 a.m. "It was nice meeting you." "Edward." "The pleasure was mine," Edward replied. "And Marco? Good luck with your interview. Remember, be yourself, that's always enough." With a grateful nod, Marco broke into a run once more, disappearing into the rain-soaked city. Edward watched him go, feeling an unexpected sense of connection to this young stranger, who had sacrificed his own interests to help someone in need. As Edward slid back into his Bentley, he finally checked his phone. 12 missed calls from Sophie, 3 from the board chairman. He dialed Sophie's number. "Edward, where are you? Everyone's waiting." "I had car trouble," he explained, "but I'm on my way now." "And Sophie? There's something I need you to check for me." "Of course, what is it?" "The interview's scheduled for today. Is there a Marco Santos on the list?" There was the sound of typing, then Sophie's voice returned. "Yes, 9 a.m. with the financial division. James Calloway is conducting the interview." Edward frowned. James Calloway was brilliant with numbers, but notoriously rigid about protocol, especially punctuality. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't let that interview end before I arrive." "May I ask why?" Edward started the car, a plan already forming in his mind. "Because I believe I just had a more revealing interview with Mr. Santos than anything James could devise in that conference room, and I want to see how this plays out." Marco arrived at the Granger and Wells reception area at 9:08 a.m., his heart pounding against his ribs. The sleek space was all glass and polished steel, with a spectacular view of rain-lashed Chicago through floor-to-ceiling windows. A striking woman with platinum blonde hair sat behind a curved marble desk, her expression as cool as the stone beneath her manicured fingertips. Good morning, Marco said, trying to control his breathlessness. I'm Marco Santos. I have an interview at 9 o'clock with Mr. Calloway. The receptionist, Vivian Clark, according to her nameplate, looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his soaked clothing and disheveled appearance. Her perfectly arched eyebrows spoke volumes before she even opened her mouth. "You're late, Mr. Santos." The words fell like icicles. "And you appear to have taken a swim on your way here." Marco's cheeks burned. "I apologize for my appearance. There was a terrible storm and We're all aware of the weather, Mr. Santos," she interrupted, glancing meaningfully at her own immaculate appearance. Yet somehow everyone else managed to arrive on time and dry. Marco swallowed his explanation about helping an elderly man change a tire. It sounded like an excuse, even to his own ears. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and said, "May I please see Mr. Calloway? I understand punctuality is important, but I'm hoping he'll still meet with me." Vivian's crimson lips curved into something adjacent to a smile. "Mr. Calloway is very particular about his schedule, but I'll check." She lifted a sleek phone and spoke in hushed tones, her eyes never leaving Marco's face. When she hung up, her expression held a hint of satisfaction. "I'm afraid Mr. Calloway has moved on to other matters. The interview window has closed." Marco felt the floor shift beneath him. 6 months of searching, 2 weeks of preparation, and his one shot at Granger and Wells, gone because of a flat tire and a rainstorm. "May I leave my portfolio for him to review?" Marco asked, his voice steady despite the disappointment crushing his chest. "I've prepared an analysis of emerging market opportunities that might interest—" "That won't be necessary," Vivian cut in. "Our hiring process is quite structured. If you'd like to apply again in 6 months, you're welcome to do so through our online portal." Behind Marco, the elevator doors opened, and several well-dressed individuals emerged, their conversations halting as they noticed his bedraggled appearance. Their whispers felt like tiny knives against his back. "He looks like he swam here. Who shows up like that for an interview? Probably another diversity hire attempt." Marco's ears burned, but he maintained his composure. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond to that treatment." He placed his portfolio on the reception desk. "Please give this to Mr. Calloway anyway. My contact information is inside. Thank you for your time, Ms. Clark." Vivian looked surprised at his persistence. She made no move to touch the portfolio. "I really can't. He's late, disheveled, soaking wet. And you expect me to hire someone who can't even show up on time?" The sharp voice cut through the reception area like a blade. Marco turned to see a tall man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and a meticulously tailored suit. His presence commanded attention, and the group behind him fell silent. This had to be James Calloway, the division head Marco had researched extensively. Known for his brilliance with numbers and his uncompromising standards, Calloway had been with Granger and Wells for 20 years, rising from analyst to managing director through sheer force of will and unerring market instincts. Marco's heart sank further. Not only had he missed his interview, but now he was being publicly dressed down by the very person he'd hoped to impress. The silence in the sleek conference room was deafening. Eyes turned toward the drenched young man standing by the elevator, his portfolio ruined, his future slipping. Just then the heavy doors opened behind them. A calm, authoritative voice interrupted the tension. "He's late because he was helping me, and I suggest you hear him out." Every head turned. Marco's breath caught in his throat. Standing in the doorway was Edward, the man from the rain. Except now, in the gleaming confines of Granger and Wells, he wasn't just Edward. The respectful hush that fell over the room, the way people instinctively straightened their postures. This was someone important. "Mr. Granger," Calloway said, his tone immediately deferential, "we weren't expecting you until the board adjourned." Marco felt the blood drain from his face. Edward Granger, the founder and CEO of Granger and Wells Capital, the man whose name was on the building, the financial visionary whose theories Marco had studied in graduate school, and Marco had made him kneel in the rain to change a tire. "James," Edward said, his tone pleasant but firm, "I'd like a word with you and Mr. Santos in the lakeside conference room. Now, please." Without waiting for a response, Edward turned to Marco. "Mr. Santos, please join us. Sophie will find you something dry to wear." A slim woman with an iPad nodded at Marco, gesturing for him to follow her down a hallway. As they walked, Marco's mind raced. Edward Granger had vouched for him, had somehow arrived before him, had requested a meeting. But why? "In here," Sophie said, opening a door to a small executive washroom. "There's a spare shirt and tie. Mr. Granger keeps extras for emergencies. Towels are in the cabinet." 10 minutes later, Marco emerged wearing a crisp white shirt that was slightly too large and a navy tie with small silver anchors. His hair was combed, his face composed, but his heart still pounded with uncertainty. Sophie led him to a conference room with a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan, its waters dark and turbulent beneath the storm clouds. Edward Granger sat at the head of a long table, engaged in quiet conversation with James Calloway, whose expression had shifted from disdain to keen interest. Both men stood as Marco entered. "Mr. Santos," Edward said, extending his hand, "properly meet James Calloway, our Director of Financial Analysis." Calloway's handshake was firm, his assessment clinical. "So you're the young man who helped our CEO change a tire in the middle of a downpour?" Marco nodded, still processing the surreal turn of events. "I didn't know who he was." "Sir, that's precisely what makes it interesting," Edward said, gesturing for everyone to sit. "You had every reason to rush past. You were already late for a life-changing interview, yet you stopped to help an old man struggling in the rain. Anyone would have done the same," Marco said quietly. Edward's eyes crinkled at the corners. "That's where you're wrong, young man. I watched at least a dozen people hurry past before you came along. Most people choose self-interest when faced with such choices. You didn't." He turned to Calloway. "James, did you review Mr. Santos's portfolio?" "I glanced at it while you were getting him situated," Calloway replied. "His analysis of microfinance opportunities in Southeast Asian markets is unconventional but intriguing. He identifies cultural factors most Western analysts overlook." Edward nodded. "I thought as much." He fixed his gaze on Marco. "Mr. Santos, I'd like you to tell us why you want to work at Granger and Wells. And please, speak from the heart, not from the rehearsed answer you've prepared." Marco took a deep breath. This was his moment. Unexpected, unprepared, but perhaps more genuine for it. "The truth is," he began, "I admire what Granger and Wells represents. Not just the success or the prestige, but the innovation. You were among the first major firms to invest significantly in developing economies, viewing them as partners rather than simply markets to exploit. That aligns with my own values." He paused, then decided to risk complete honesty. "But I also need this job. My visa has specific requirements. My family back home has sacrificed for my education. I want to make them proud, learn from the best, and eventually take those skills back to the Philippines, where they're desperately needed." A silence fell over the room. Marco couldn't read Edward's expression, but Calloway was studying him with newfound intensity. "Well," Edward said finally, "I think we've heard enough to make a decision." Marco held his breath, preparing himself for either outcome. Edward Granger had built his reputation on seeing patterns others missed. In the financial world, this meant identifying market trends before they emerged, recognizing value where others saw only risk. But his greatest skill, the one that had truly built his empire, was his ability to read people. As he studied the young man sitting across from him, Edward saw something familiar, a hunger that transcended ambition, an integrity that couldn't be taught in business schools. Marco Santos reminded Edward of himself 40 years ago, before success had insulated him from life's harsher realities. "James," Edward said, "what position was Mr. Santos interviewing for?" Calloway consulted his tablet. "Junior financial analyst, starting salary. $85,000 plus standard benefits." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "And what are your impressions now that you've reviewed his materials?" "He's qualified on paper," Calloway admitted. "His technical skills are sound, and his perspective on Asian markets could be valuable. But," he hesitated, glancing at Marco, "our culture emphasizes reliability and professionalism. Being late to the interview raises concerns." "Even though the reason was helping the CEO change a tire?" Edward asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Calloway cleared his throat. "That's an unusual circumstance." "Life is full of unusual circumstances, James. What matters is how we respond to them." Edward turned to Marco. "Mr. Santos, I have a proposal for you, but first, I'd like to hear more about your work in Manila. You mentioned microfinance models that increased lending efficiency while reducing defaults. Tell me more. Marco blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Oh, yes. At Rizal, I noticed that traditional risk assessment models weren't capturing important cultural factors in rural communities. Family structures, community relationships, these create accountability systems that don't show up in conventional metrics. As Marco elaborated, his initial nervousness faded. His hands sketched invisible patterns in the air, his eyes lit up with genuine passion. He described visiting remote villages, interviewing farmers and small business owners, and developing algorithms that incorporated these soft factors into lending decisions. The result was a 22% increase in approved loans to borrowers who would have been rejected under traditional models, with a 17% decrease in defaults, Marco concluded. People repay loans when they feel seen and valued, not just evaluated. Edward nodded, impressed. This was exactly the kind of innovative thinking Granger and Wells needed, especially now as they expanded further into emerging markets. Very interesting, Edward said. Now about that proposal. Mr. Santos, I'm not offering you the junior analyst position. Marco's face fell, but he maintained his composure. I understand, sir. No, I don't think you do, Edward continued. I'm offering you something different. We're establishing a new emerging markets initiative focused specifically on Southeast Asia. We need someone who understands both the numbers and the nuances. Someone who can bridge Western financial models with Eastern cultural contexts. Marco's eyes widened. Sir, I'd like you to join as a senior analyst for the initiative, reporting directly to me. The salary would be $120,000, plus performance bonuses and relocation assistance. The room fell silent. Calloway looked stunned. Marco seemed unable to process what he was hearing. Mr. Granger, Marco finally managed. I'm deeply honored, but why? You barely know me. Edward leaned forward. I know enough. I know you have the technical skills. Your portfolio demonstrates that. I know you have the cultural understanding we need. But most importantly, I know you have character. When faced with a choice between self-interest and helping someone in need, you chose compassion, even at personal cost. That's rare, Mr. Santos, and it's precisely the kind of judgment I want influencing our investments. Marco's expression shifted from shock to something deeper, a recognition of the moment's significance. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Edward replied simply. We'll work out the details with HR today. Marco nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. Yes, thank you. I won't disappoint you. I know you won't. Edward stood, signaling the end of the meeting. James will show you to HR. I have a board meeting to conclude. As Calloway led a still dazed Marco from the room, Edward called after them. Oh, and Mr. Santos, keep the tie. Consider it your first bonus. When they were gone, Edward moved to the window, watching the storm begin to subside over Lake Michigan. Sophie entered quietly behind him. That was unexpected, she observed. The board is curious about why you rushed out of the meeting. Tell them I was securing an investment in our future, Edward replied, still gazing at the shifting clouds. Sophie, do you remember when I started this company? Before my time, she said with a smile. But I've heard the stories. I was nobody, a kid from South Chicago with good math skills and big ideas. The only reason I got my chance was because someone like me had a flat tire in the rain, and someone like young Mr. Santos stopped to help. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Is that true? The details were different, but the essence is the same. Edward turned from the window. William Arthurs, my first mentor, the man who gave me my start, once told me that he invested in me not because of my business plan, but because of how I helped an elderly woman who collapsed at the bus stop on my way to meet him. You were late to that meeting too. 30 minutes. William had already left his office. I caught him in the parking garage. Edward smiled at the memory. He said character reveals itself in the choices we make when we think no one who matters is watching. And now you're paying it forward, Sophie said. Something like that. Edward straightened his tie. Have legal prepare the offer letter for Mr. Santos by end of day. And Sophie, make sure Vivian in reception understands that her job is to welcome people to Granger and Wells, not to judge them. With pleasure, Sophie replied, making a note on her iPad. As Edward prepared to return to his board meeting, He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The financial world was often criticized for its cold calculations and profit-above-all mentality. Today, he had remembered why he entered it in the first place, not just to make money but to create opportunity, to recognize value where others saw only risk. In Marco Santos, he saw not just an employee, but a reminder of the human element that truly drove success. Numbers were important, but people, their stories, their character, their potential, those were the real assets worth investing in. The storm outside had cleared, sunlight now streaming through the windows. Edward smiled at the symbolism. Sometimes the darkest storms revealed the most promising horizons. Marco's first day at Granger & Wells began at 7:30 a.m., a full hour and a half before his official start time. The early summer sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline as he passed through the revolving doors. Employee badge clipped proudly to his lapel. He had chosen his outfit meticulously, a charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, a light blue shirt and the navy tie with silver anchors that Edward had given him. It felt like a talisman of sorts, a physical reminder that his life had changed in ways he still couldn't fully comprehend. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man named Terence according to his nameplate, greeted him with surprise. "First one in today, Mr. Santos? Even earlier than Mr. Granger, and that's saying something." Marco smiled. "I wanted to get settled before things get busy." "Smart man." Terence nodded approvingly. "Ninth floor's all yours for now. Coffee shop in the lobby opens at 8 if you need fuel." The elevator ride gave Marco a moment to gather his thoughts. Just 3 weeks had passed since the fateful interview, yet everything had changed. He'd moved from his leaking apartment to a modern studio in River North, courtesy of the relocation package. His visa status had been expedited through the company's legal team. His parents had cried with pride during their video call when he shared the news, his father repeatedly saying, "I knew you could do it, Anak. I always knew." The Emerging Markets Initiative occupied a corner section of the 9th floor with sweeping views of the Chicago River. As the elevator doors opened, Marco found himself in a space that was still under construction. Designers were installing glass partitions, technicians were running cables, and workers were assembling sleek standing desks. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Sophie Hartman, Edward's executive assistant, directing the activity with quiet authority. She spotted Marco and waved him over. "Mr. Santos, you're early," she said, checking her watch. "Perfect timing, actually. I was about to call you. Mr. Granger wants to see you in his office at 8. Marco felt a flutter of nervousness. "Is everything okay?" Sophie's smile was reassuring. "More than okay. He's assembling your team today, and he wants your input." "My team?" Marco echoed, surprised. "Did you think you'd be doing this alone?" Sophie laughed lightly. "The initiative is a major priority for the firm. You'll have resources." She handed him a security card. "This will get you to the executive floor. 42nd floor, end of the hall. Mr. Granger is expecting you." As Marco headed back to the elevator, Sophie called after him. "Oh, and Marco? Vivian won't be at reception anymore. We've made some personnel adjustments." The executive floor was a study in understated power. No flashy logos or ostentatious displays of wealth, just clean lines, museum-quality art, and hushed efficiency. A young woman with a warm smile greeted him at the reception desk. "Mr. Santos, welcome. I'm Elena. Mr. Granger is on a call but asked me to show you in. Would you like coffee while you wait?" Minutes later, Marco sat in a comfortable chair in Edward's corner office, taking in the panoramic views of Lake Michigan. The space reflected its occupant, thoughtfully arranged, quietly confident, with subtle touches that revealed the man behind the mogul. Family photos on a side table, a collection of vintage financial calculators displayed like works of art, a well-worn copy of The Wealth of Nations on the desk. "Admiring the view?" Edward's voice came from behind him. "I never get tired of it myself." Marco stood quickly. "Good morning, Mr. Granger." "Edward, please, at least when it's just us." The older man gestured for Marco to sit again as he took his own seat behind the desk. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, sir." "Edward, the relocation assistance was incredibly helpful, and everyone has been welcoming." Edward nodded, pleased. "Good. Now, let's talk about your team." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Elena, are they here?" "Yes, sir, in the conference room." "Perfect, we'll be right there." Edward stood, straightening his tie. I've selected 3 people to start with. You'll have budget for more as the initiative grows, but I believe in starting small and focused. May I ask how you chose them? Marco inquired as they walked down the hallway. Edward's eyes crinkled with amusement. The same way I chose you, technical excellence, certainly, but also character. People who see beyond the numbers to the lives those numbers represent. The conference room contained 3 individuals who rose as Edward and Marco entered. Edward made the introductions. Marco Santos, meet your team. Layla Washington, our tech specialist. She's designed some of our most successful trading algorithms. A tall black woman with close-cropped hair and intelligent eyes nodded at Marco. Daniel Chen, research analyst with expertise in regulatory frameworks across Asian markets. A young man with wire-rimmed glasses smiled warmly. And Fatima Al-Zahrani, communications specialist who speaks 7 languages and has worked extensively in diplomatic circles. A woman in a modest hijab extended her hand with a confident grip. Together, Edward continued, you'll develop investment strategies that serve both our clients and the communities we invest in. I don't just want profits, I want impact. Real people building better lives because of the capital we provide. Marco felt a weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it was balanced by a surge of excitement. This was why he had studied so hard, worked so diligently, to make a meaningful difference. I won't keep you, Edward concluded. You have a lot to discuss. Marco, they've all been briefed on your background and ideas. Lead the conversation. This is your initiative now. As Edward departed, a momentary silence fell over the room. Marco looked at the 3 expectant faces and realized they were waiting for him to speak, his first moment as a leader. Thank you all for joining this team, he began, his voice steadier than he expected. I believe we have an opportunity to do something truly innovative here. But before I share my ideas, I'd like to hear yours. What drew each of you to this initiative? Layla spoke first, her voice rich and deliberate. Honestly, I was getting bored writing. Algorithms that just made rich people richer. When Edward described what you're trying to do, using financial tools to empower communities, I thought, finally, something worth coding for. Daniel nodded vigorously. My parents were immigrants from Taiwan. They built a successful restaurant business because someone took a chance on them with a small business loan. I've always wanted to create those same opportunities for others. Fatima's eyes shone with conviction. I've seen how traditional investment models often fail in cultures where community is valued over individuality. We need approaches that honor different worldviews while creating genuine prosperity. As his team members shared their stories, Marco felt something powerful taking shape, a shared vision forming from their diverse perspectives. These weren't just colleagues, they were kindred spirits, each bringing unique strengths to a common purpose. For the first time since arriving in America, Marco felt truly at home. The meeting stretched through the morning as ideas flowed freely. They mapped potential markets on a digital board, debated risk assessment models, and identified communities where initial pilot programs might thrive. Marco found himself not just contributing, but guiding the conversation, drawing out each person's expertise and weaving it into a coherent strategy. By lunchtime, they had the outline of a plan that excited them all, a phased approach focusing initially on 3 countries, with technology-enabled microfinance at its core. But unlike traditional models, theirs would incorporate community participation in investment decisions and profit-sharing structures that aligned incentives across all stakeholders. This is ambitious, Daniel remarked as they wrapped up. Most firms would consider it too complex, too different from how things are usually done. Marco smiled. That's exactly why we're doing it at Granger & Wells. Edward didn't hire us to follow the usual path. As the team gathered their materials to break for lunch, Marco felt his phone vibrate with a text message. It was from his father in Manila. How is your first day, Anak? Your mother and I are thinking of you. Marco paused, taking in the moment, the Chicago skyline through the windows, his new colleagues animatedly discussing their morning's work, the badge with his name and the prestigious company logo. A wave of gratitude washed over him for the flat tire in the rain, for the choice he'd made to stop and help, for the unexpected path that had led him here. He typed a simple reply, "Better than I could have imagined, Pa. I think I've found where I'm meant to be." 3 months into his role at Granger & Wells, Marco had settled into a rhythm. His days began early and ended late, filled with research, strategy sessions, and countless video calls with potential partners across Southeast Asia. The Emerging Markets Initiative was taking shape, with pilot programs planned in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. His team had grown to 7 people, each bringing valuable expertise to the ambitious project. But on this particular Wednesday morning, Marco sensed trouble the moment he stepped off the elevator. Fatima intercepted him before he could reach his office, her expression tense. "We have a situation," she said quietly, walking alongside him. "The board is questioning the initiative's timeline. There's a meeting in 30 minutes. Edward wants you there." Marco felt his stomach tighten. What happened? "Harrison Webb happened," Fatima replied, naming one of the firm's most influential board members. "He's been reviewing our projections and thinks we're moving too slowly. He's pushing to change our approach, focus on larger loans to established businesses instead of the microfinance model." Marco frowned. The microfinance approach, providing small loans to entrepreneurs who lacked access to traditional banking, was the heart of their strategy. What Webb was suggesting would fundamentally alter the initiative's purpose. "That defeats the entire point," Marco said as they reached his office. "We're trying to create opportunity where it doesn't exist, not just find safer investments." "I know," Fatima agreed, "but Webb carries a lot of weight. He's one of the largest shareholders, and he's bringing others to his side." She handed Marco a tablet. "These are his counter-proposals. You should review them before the meeting." Marco scanned the document, his concern deepening. Webb's approach was textbook corporate finance, efficient, proven, and utterly conventional. It would generate steady returns with minimal risk. It would also exclude precisely the communities the initiative was designed to serve. "Where's Edward in all this?" Marco asked. Fatima's expression softened slightly. "Supporting you. But he's in a delicate position. The board respects him immensely, but they also expect financial discipline. This is your project to defend, Marco." 30 minutes later, Marco entered the executive boardroom, a space he'd seen only once before during his orientation. Today, it felt like an arena. Around the polished mahogany table sat 12 people, the firm's most senior leaders, including Edward at the head and Harrison Webb to his right. Webb was exactly as Marco had imagined from the articles he'd read. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having the final word. His calculating gaze fixed on Marco as Edward made introductions. "Mr. Santos," Webb said when Edward finished, "I've been studying your initiative with great interest. You have ambitious goals." "Thank you, Mr. Webb," Marco replied, taking the empty seat across from him. "We believe the potential impact justifies the ambition." Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Impact is commendable, but this firm's primary responsibility is to our investors. Your current approach projects first returns in 36 months. That's a long horizon for unproven markets." "The markets aren't unproven, sir," Marco countered respectfully. "They're simply underserved by traditional finance. Our research indicates substantial growth potential with the right approach." "Ah, yes, your right approach." Webb gestured to the document displayed on screens around the room. "Thousands of microloans to recipients with limited credit history, based on alternative assessment metrics you've developed. It's innovative, certainly, also highly risky." Several board members nodded in agreement. Marco felt the momentum shifting against him. "Mr. Webb has proposed an alternative," Edward interjected, his tone neutral. "Marco, we'd like your assessment of his strategy." Marco took a deep breath. This was his test, not just of his financial acumen, but of his conviction. He thought of his father's wisdom. "Stand for what you believe, but do so with respect. Bridges burn quickly, but take years to rebuild." "Mr. Webb's proposal is excellent traditional finance," Marco began carefully. "It would likely yield the returns he projects with considerably less risk than our current approach." Webb looked pleased, but Marco continued, "However, it also abandons the core purpose of the initiative. We didn't set out to find safe investments in emerging markets. We set out to create a new model, one that recognizes potential where traditional metrics don't see it." Marco tapped his tablet, bringing up a different document on the room's displays. "This is data from my previous work in the Philippines. It shows repayment rates for microloans to entrepreneurs who would have been rejected by conventional assessment." When we incorporated community factors and provided basic financial education, the default rate was just 4%, better than many corporate loans. The board members leaned forward, studying the figures with professional interest. Furthermore, Marco continued, gaining confidence, these loans created an average of 2.3 jobs per recipient within 18 months. That's economic development at the grassroots level, sustainable, organic growth that builds communities rather than just extracting value from them. Webb's expression remained skeptical. Admirable results, Mr. Santos, but on a very small scale. Can this model work across multiple countries with the volume needed to justify our investment? That's precisely what we intend to prove, Marco replied, and we've designed a phased approach specifically to test and refine the model before full-scale implementation. He brought up a new slide showing a 3-year timeline. We're not asking for blind faith, Mr. Webb. We've established clear milestones with measurable outcomes. If we don't hit these targets at each phase, we pivot or scale back. The room fell quiet as the board members considered Marco's presentation. Edward sat silently, his expression giving nothing away. This was Marco's battle to win or lose. Finally, Webb spoke. You make a compelling case for the social value, Mr. Santos, but I remain concerned about the financial returns. Our fiduciary duty is to create sustainable value, Marco interrupted, then immediately regretted his boldness. Forgive me, Mr. Webb, but I believe there's no conflict between financial returns and social impact in this case. In fact, the social components are what will drive our competitive advantage. He turned to address the entire board. Traditional firms can't execute this strategy effectively because they lack the cultural understanding and community connections. We're not just making loans, we're building an ecosystem that will generate returns for decades. Yes, it takes longer initially, but the competitive moat it creates will be nearly impossible for others to cross. Webb leaned back, studying Marco with newfound interest. You truly believe in this, don't you? I do, Marco said simply. Enough to stake my career on it. An unexpected smile crossed Webb's face. Well, that makes this more interesting. He turned to Edward. You found another true believer, Ed. Reminds me of you 30 years ago, convinced you could change the rules of the game. Edward's eyes twinkled. I did change them, Harrison. That's why we're all sitting in this building. Webb chuckled, then addressed Marco again. I still have concerns about your timeline, Mr. Santos. But I respect your conviction and your preparation. How about this? Maintain your approach but add quarterly review checkpoints where the board can assess progress. If you miss 2 consecutive targets, we revisit the strategy. Marco considered the offer. It was reasonable, demanding, but fair. Agreed, Mr. Webb, thank you. As the meeting concluded, board members filed out, several stopping to shake Marco's hand or offer words of encouragement. Webb lingered, examining Marco with the appraising eye of a seasoned investor. You stood your ground well today, young man, he said. That counts for something with me. I'll be watching your progress with interest. When only Marco and Edward remained, the older man finally spoke. You passed. Marco blinked. I'm sorry? Harrison isn't actually opposed to your approach, Edward explained, a smile playing at his lips. He and I discussed the initiative at length before approving it. What happened today was a test of your conviction, your preparation, and your ability to defend your vision without compromising its essence. A test? Marco repeated, stunned. The whole meeting was staged? Edward shook his head. Not staged. Harrison's concerns are genuine, as is his solution, but he needed to see that you wouldn't fold under pressure, that you truly believe in what you're building. As understanding dawned, Marco felt a complex mixture of emotions, relief, pride, and a touch of indignation at being tested without his knowledge. Edward seemed to read his thoughts. Leadership isn't just about having good ideas, Marco. It's about defending them when challenged, adapting without abandoning your principles. Today you showed the board you can do both. Marco nodded slowly. And if I'd failed the test? Edward's expression grew serious. Then we would have learned something important about your readiness for this role, but you didn't fail. You rose to the occasion. As Marco absorbed this, Edward added, remember this feeling, Marco. The doubt before, the pressure during, the relief after. Leadership is a series of such moments, and how you handle them defines not just your career, but who you become in the process. 6 months into the Emerging Markets Initiative, Marco received an email that made his heart race. The subject line read simply, "Pilot Program Approval, Manila." After weeks of negotiations, their first microfinance hub had been approved by local partners and government officials. The initiative was moving from planning to implementation, and its first destination would be Marco's homeland. "We're going to the Philippines next week," Marco announced to his team during their morning meeting. "The Manila hub is officially happening." Cheers erupted around the conference table. This was what they had been working toward, the moment when their ideas would begin transforming from spreadsheets into real-world impact. "Who's we?" Daniel asked when the celebration subsided. "Layla, Fatima, and myself," Marco replied. "Layla to set up our technology platform, Fatima to handle communications and relationship building, and me to, well, to go home." The trip. Preparations flew by in a blur of logistics, presentations, and late nights finalizing details. Edward insisted on meeting with Marco before his departure, inviting him to lunch at a small Vietnamese restaurant tucked away in an unassuming storefront near Chinatown. "Best pho in Chicago," Edward declared as they settled into a worn booth. "I've been coming here for 20 years. The owner's daughter received one of our first entrepreneurial grants." As they enjoyed the steaming bowls of fragrant broth, Edward grew reflective. "How does it feel going back as a different person than when you left?" Marco considered the question. "I'm not sure I am a different person," he said finally. "I have a different job, different clothes maybe. But inside, I think I'm still the same Marco who left Manila." Edward smiled approvingly. "Good answer. The most dangerous thing success can do is convince you that you've become someone else, someone better than your origins. The best leaders remember where they came from." He handed Marco a small box. A going-away present, or rather, a going-home present. Inside was a pair of silver cufflinks, elegant but not ostentatious, engraved with small anchors that matched the tie Edward had given him on his first day. "For your big presentations," Edward said, "a reminder to stay anchored to your purpose, no matter what storms come your way." Marco was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you. I'll wear them proudly." "There's something else I want to discuss," Edward continued, his tone shifting to business. "The board is impressed with your progress, so impressed that we're considering accelerating the initiative's expansion. After Manila, we may be ready to launch in Vietnam and Indonesia simultaneously rather than sequentially." Marco's eyes widened. "That's months ahead of schedule." "It is. Do you think your team can handle it?" Marco thought about the talented people he'd assembled, their dedication and creativity. "Yes," he said with confidence, "and we can handle it." Edward nodded, satisfied. "That's what I told the board. Oh, and one more thing. Harrison Webb has requested to join you in Manila for the launch event." Marco nearly choked on his foe. "Mr. Webb wants to come to Manila? He's taking a personal interest in your work. Said he wants to see the model in action before the expansion." "Decision." Edward's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I believe you've made quite an impression on our most skeptical board member." 3 days later, Marco found himself on a trans-Pacific flight, watching the vast ocean pass beneath the wings. Layla and Fatima had taken earlier flights to begin preparations, leaving Marco to travel with Harrison Webb, who had insisted they take the corporate jet. The luxurious aircraft was a far cry from the cramped economy seat Marco had endured on his journey to America. Yet as he sank into the soft leather, he felt a strange melancholy. This return to the Philippines, triumphant, successful, arriving on a private jet, was everything he had dreamed of. So why did it feel complicated? Webb seemed to sense his mood. "First time going home since you left?" Marco nodded. "Almost a year now." "Ah." Webb looked out the window thoughtfully. "It's never simple, is it? Going back." Something in the older man's tone suggested personal experience. Marco had researched Webb extensively before their board meeting, but found little about his background. The official biography mentioned only an economics degree from Princeton and a meteoric rise through investment banking before joining Granger and Wells. "Have you been to the Philippines before, Mr. Webb?" Marco asked. "Harrison, please. And yes, many times. Mostly Manila, though I've always wanted to see more of the islands." He paused. "My mother was Filipino, actually, from Cebu." Marco couldn't hide his surprise. "I had no idea." Webb's expression softened with reminiscence. "She met my father when he was stationed at the naval base. I grew up in the States, but we visited her family when I was young. A shadow crossed his face. After she passed, my father never took me back. I didn't return until I was in my 30s, trying to reconnect with that part of myself. The revelation cast Webb in an entirely new light. Is that why you're interested in the initiative? Partly, Webb acknowledged. Though I'd never let sentiment cloud business judgment, but yes, I understand better than most how traditional Western financial models fail to capture the realities of life in places like the Philippines. Community, family, word of honor. These aren't just cultural curiosities, they're economic factors that our industry has systematically undervalued. For the remainder of the flight, they talked not as executive and board member, but as two men with shared connections to a place, comparing favorite foods, laughing over cultural peculiarities, and discussing the complex history that had shaped the Philippines. Marco found himself genuinely enjoying Webb's company, appreciating the older man's insights and wry humor. As the plane began its descent into Manila, the sprawling metropolis came into view, a chaotic tapestry of modern skyscrapers, colonial architecture, and informal settlements stretching to the horizon. The sight sent a surge of emotion through Marco's chest. Pride, nostalgia, love, and a complicated sense of responsibility. "Welcome home, Marco," Webb said quietly. The next morning dawned hot and humid, typical Manila weather that Marco had almost forgotten in Chicago's more temperate climate. He stood in his hotel room, adjusting his tie and the anchor cufflinks Edward had given him. Today was the official launch of the initiative's first microfinance hub, a renovated building in Binondo, Manila's historic Chinatown, and one of the oldest business districts in the world. A knock at his door revealed Fatima, elegant in a modest business suit adapted for the tropical climate. "Everyone's waiting in the lobby. The local press is already at the venue." "How's Layla doing with the tech setup?" Marco asked, as they walked toward the elevator. "Finished at 2 a.m. and insists it's perfect," Fatima replied with a smile. She recruited 3 local IT students to help and is already talking about hiring them permanently. In the hotel lobby, they joined Layla, Webb, and their local partners, representatives from a community development organization, a technical university, and a regional bank that had agreed to collaborate on the project. Together, they formed a procession of vehicles heading to Binondo. As they navigated Manila's notorious traffic, Marco pointed out landmarks to his colleagues: the historic walled city of Intramuros, the cultural complex at Rizal Park, the gleaming towers of Makati's business district. He felt a growing sense of pride seeing his homeland through their interested eyes. The Binondo hub was housed in a colonial-era building that had been carefully restored, its historic facade preserved while the interior had been transformed into a modern workspace. Outside, a modest crowd had gathered, local business owners, students, community leaders, and several journalists with cameras and microphones. As Marco stepped from the car, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see his parents pushing through the crowd, his mother's eyes already brimming with tears, his father standing tall with undisguised pride. "Ma! Pa!" Marco embraced them both, emotion overwhelming his professional composure. It had been nearly a year since he'd seen them in person, their relationship maintained through video calls and text messages. "Look at you," his mother said, straightening his already perfect tie. "So handsome. So important now." "Not that important, Ma," Marco said with a smile. "Important enough to come home on a private plane," his father observed with a raised eyebrow. "We heard all about it from your cousin at the airport." Webb approached and Marco made introductions. "Sir, these are my parents, Elena and Roberto Santos. Ma, Pa, this is Harrison Webb, one of our board members." To Marco's surprise, Webb greeted his parents with a respectful bow of the head and a few phrases in perfect Tagalog. His mother's eyes widened with delight. "Your son is making quite an impression at Granger and Wells," Webb told them. "We have high expectations for this project he's designed." "He has always exceeded expectations," Roberto said simply, with the quiet confidence of a father who had never doubted his son's abilities. As they moved toward the building for the official ceremony, Marco felt a profound sense of worlds colliding. His childhood and his career, his family and his colleagues, his past and his future, all converging in this moment of return. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Manila hub was scheduled for 10 a.m., but in true Filipino fashion, It began 45 minutes late. No one seemed particularly concerned by this except Layla, who checked her watch repeatedly until Fatima gently reminded her that they were operating on Filipino time. Now, Marco stood on a small stage erected in front of the building, facing an audience that had grown considerably since their arrival. Local officials had appeared, university students had wandered over from nearby campuses, and neighborhood residents watched curiously from windows and doorways. Behind him sat a row of dignitaries: Webb, the local partners, a representative from the American embassy, and to Marco's surprise and delight, his parents, who had been given seats of honor at Webb's insistence. As Marco approached the microphone, he felt a momentary flutter of nerves. This wasn't like presenting to the board in Chicago. This was his community, his people. Their judgment mattered in a different, deeper way. "Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat," he began in Tagalog, greeting the crowd. A ripple of appreciation passed through the audience at his use of the native language. Today marks the beginning of something new, but it's built on something very old, the Filipino spirit of bayanihan, of community lifting each other up. Marco continued, alternating between English and Tagalog, explaining the initiative's mission: to provide capital, technology, and mentorship to entrepreneurs who had been excluded from traditional financial systems. The hub would offer microloans ranging from P10,000 to 500,000, along with business training, technology access, and networking opportunities. But what makes this different, Marco emphasized, is that we're not just bringing Western financial models to the Philippines, we're creating something new together, something that honors Filipino values and realities. The decisions about who receives funding will be made here by people who understand local needs and potentials. As Marco outlined the specifics of the program, he noticed his father listening intently, nodding at certain points. Roberto Santos had spent decades teaching mathematics to students who often couldn't afford calculators, finding creative ways to make abstract concepts tangible with limited resources. His practical ingenuity had shaped Marco's approach to financial innovation. After the formal presentation came the actual ribbon cutting. Marco invited his parents to join him, along with Webb and the local partners. As flashbulbs popped and applause erupted, Marco caught his mother wiping away tears. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of tours, interviews, and meetings. The hub buzzed with activity as potential loan recipients arrived to learn about the program. Local students explored the technology center, and community leaders discussed potential collaborations. By late afternoon, Marco was exhausted but exhilarated. He found a quiet moment to sit with his parents in the hub's small courtyard, where a century-old mango tree provided welcome shade. "What do you think, Pa?" Marco asked, eager for his father's assessment. Roberto considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "It's impressive, anak, but the real test will come in the months ahead, when the excitement fades and the real work begins. That's why I'm staying in Manila for the next month," Marco said, "to make sure we build strong foundations." His mother looked surprised. "A whole month? You didn't mention this." "It was just confirmed yesterday. I'll be working here, living at home if that's okay with you both." Elena's face lit up. "Of course it's okay. Your room is exactly as you left it." Roberto's expression remained pensive. "And your important job in Chicago? They can spare you for so long?" "This is my important job, Pa," Marco explained. "Making sure this succeeds is exactly what Granger and Wells hired me to do." His father nodded, satisfied. "You've come far, son. When you left for America, I worried. Not about your abilities, but about whether they would see your true value." Marco thought of Edward Granger, stopping to help him change the tire despite the rain and his own importance. Some did, Pa. Some very important people did. Later that evening, Webb hosted a dinner at one of Manila's finest restaurants, gathering the Granger and Wells team, key local partners, and, at Marco's insistence, his parents. The private dining room offered spectacular views of Manila Bay, where the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. As the meal progressed through multiple courses of Filipino cuisine reimagined with modern techniques, conversation flowed easily between guests from different worlds. Marco watched with amusement as his mother charmed Webb with stories of Marco's childhood mathematical prowess, while his father engaged Layla in a detailed discussion about how technology could address educational inequities in rural areas. During a lull in the conversation, Webb tapped his glass for attention. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced, rising to his feet. "Today I witnessed something remarkable, not just a business launch, but a homecoming. Marco, when you first defended this initiative in our boardroom, I questioned whether your approach was too idealistic. I wondered if you were letting personal connection cloud your business judgment." Webb's gaze swept the room, taking in the diverse gathering. "I was wrong. Your connection to this place, these people, it isn't a liability. It's your greatest asset. You understand both worlds and can build bridges between them. That's rare, and it's exactly what makes this initiative different from 1,000 other well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective programs." He raised his glass higher. "To Marco, Santos and the Manila Hub, the first of many, and to Roberto and Elena Santos, who raised a son with both roots and wings. Mabuhay." As glasses clinked and congratulations echoed, Marco felt a profound sense of alignment, as if the disparate pieces of his life were finally fitting together. The boy who had solved mathematical puzzles in Manila had become the man creating financial solutions in Chicago, and now he was bringing that journey full circle. After dinner, as guests began to depart, Webb drew Marco aside. "I'm heading back to Chicago tomorrow, but before I go, I wanted to share something with you." He handed Marco an envelope. "The board vote was unanimous. We're approving the accelerated timeline for Vietnam and Indonesia." Marco opened the envelope to find official authorization for the expansion, along with an increased budget allocation. "Thank you, Harrison. The team will be thrilled." "Don't thank me," Webb replied. "This was earned, not given. What I saw today convinced me that your model works, not just on paper but in practice. You've created something that balances financial viability with genuine social impact." He clasped Marco's shoulder. "Edward saw something in you that day in the rain. Now we all see it." As Marco watched Webb walk away, he felt the weight of expectations and opportunity. The initiative was growing faster than anticipated, bringing new challenges and responsibilities. But for tonight, he would simply appreciate how far he had come. Outside the restaurant, his parents waited for him, ready to take him home, back to the house where he had grown up, the room where he had dreamed of making a difference in the world. Tomorrow would bring meetings and decisions, and the hard work of building something meaningful. Tonight was for gratitude. "Ready to go home, Anak?" his mother asked, linking her arm through his. Marco nodded, looking out at the city lights reflecting on Manila Bay. "Yes, Ma, I'm ready." 1 year after the Manila Hub's launch, Marco stood in the same spot where he had cut the ribbon, marveling at the transformation. What had begun as an experiment was now a thriving ecosystem of entrepreneurship. The colonial building hummed with activity, local business owners consulting with mentors, technology classes in session, community meetings discussing new initiatives. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Layla remarked, joining him in the courtyard. She had flown in from Jakarta, where she was overseeing the technology implementation for their newest hub. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Marco replied. "Other times, it feels like we've been doing this forever." The Emerging Markets Initiative had expanded beyond their most optimistic projections. After Manila's success, the Vietnam and Indonesia hubs had launched simultaneously, followed by Thailand and Malaysia. Each location adapted the core model to local contexts while maintaining the fundamental principles: community involvement, culturally appropriate assessment metrics, and technology enablement. Marco's role had evolved as well. He now held the title of Executive Director, dividing his time between Chicago and the various Asian hubs. His team had grown to 35 people across 6 countries, with plans to expand into Africa the following year. "The anniversary event starts in an hour," Layla reminded him. "Fatima sent me to find you. Apparently the mayor arrived early and Edward's plane just landed." Edward had made a point of attending each hub's launch personally, but this would be his first return to Manila since the initiative began. His support had remained unwavering, defending the program during quarterly reviews and championing its expansion to the board. "I'll be right there," Marco assured her. "Just wanted a quiet moment to take it all in." As Layla departed, Marco's phone chimed with a message from his father. "We're here. Your mother is already crying, and nothing has happened yet." Marco smiled. His parents had become unofficial ambassadors for the program, with his father volunteering as a financial literacy instructor and his mother organizing community events. Their involvement had inspired other retirees to contribute their expertise, creating an intergenerational knowledge exchange that benefited everyone. The anniversary celebration was scheduled as a day-long festival, showcasing businesses that had received funding through the hub. The courtyard and surrounding streets had been transformed with colorful banners, food stalls, and product displays. Local musicians performed on a small stage, while children darted through the crowd with painted faces. Marco made his way through the bustling space, greeting loan recipients by name, inquiring about their families and businesses. These relationships were the heart of the initiative's success, the human connections that transcended transactions. Near the entrance, he spotted Edward in conversation with a young woman selling handcrafted jewelry. Despite his status, Edward had an uncanny ability to make people feel at ease, listening intently as she explained her production process. "Marco," Edward called, waving him over. "Maria here was just telling me how she's expanded from a one-person operation to employing 5 other women. Impressive growth in just 8 months." Maria beamed with pride. "Mr. Santos's program changed everything. The loan helped, yes, but the business training and the mentor they assigned me, these made the real difference." After promising to visit Maria's workshop later, Edward and Marco found a quiet corner to talk. The older man looked tired but energized, the transcontinental flight unable to dampen his enthusiasm. "This exceeds even my highest hopes," Edward said, surveying the vibrant scene. "When I approved this initiative, I believed in the concept, but seeing it in action, the real human impact, it's extraordinary. We've been lucky," Marco acknowledged. "The right partners, the right timing." Edward shook his head. "This isn't luck, Marco. This is what happens when vision meets preparation and perseverance. You've built something remarkable here." The formal ceremony began at noon, with speeches from local officials, testimonials from program participants, and presentations on the hub's economic impact. Data showed that the initiative had funded 312 businesses in its first year, with a repayment rate of 98.2%. More impressively, those businesses had created over 700 new jobs and sparked ancillary economic activity throughout their communities. When it was Marco's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief, focusing on individual stories rather than statistics. He invited several entrepreneurs to join him on stage, letting them share their experiences in their own words. Their authentic voices, proud, grateful, determined, resonated more powerfully than any corporate presentation could have. As the ceremony concluded and guests dispersed to enjoy the festival, Marco found himself approached by an elderly man he didn't recognize, distinguished in appearance, with silver hair and alert eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Santos," the man said, extending his hand, "congratulations on your success. I've been following your work with great interest." "Thank you," Marco replied, trying to place the familiar face. "I'm sorry. Have we met before?" The man smiled. "Not formally. My name is William Arthurs. I'm an old friend of Edward's." Marco's eyes widened in recognition. William Arthurs, the mentor Edward had mentioned, the man who had given him his start when Edward was just a promising young man from South Chicago. "Mr. Arthurs, Edward has spoken of you. It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine," Arthurs replied. "I came with Edward to see this program firsthand. He's quite proud of what you've built, you know." "I couldn't have done it without his support," Marco said sincerely. Arthurs's eyes twinkled. "That's how it works, young man. Someone sees potential in you, gives you an opportunity, and then you do the same for others. It's the only meaningful legacy any of us can leave." He gestured to the bustling festival around them. "Edward tells me you stopped to help him change a tire the day of your interview, a small kindness that altered both your lives." Marco nodded, remembering that rainy morning that now seemed so long ago. "I almost didn't stop. I was already late and my future was hanging in the balance." "Yet you did stop," Arthurs observed, "just as someone stopped for me once, when I was stranded with my pregnant wife during a snowstorm, just as I later stopped for Edward, when he helped an elderly woman who collapsed at a bus stop." Marco stared at him in astonishment. "Are you saying that there's a chain of kindness linking us?" "Perhaps," Arthurs smiled enigmatically. "Or perhaps it's simply that character reveals itself in the choices we make when we think no one who matters is watching." Before Marco could respond, Arthur's was called away by Edward. As the elderly mentor departed, Marco felt a strange sense of connection to something larger than himself, a lineage of opportunity and responsibility that transcended individual success. Throughout the afternoon, Marco moved through the festival, reconnecting with loan recipients, introducing Edward to local partners, and enjoying the simple pleasure of seeing his vision realized. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard, he found a quiet moment with his parents beneath the old mango tree. "I'm proud of you, Anak," his father said simply. "Not because of the title or the success, but because you've remained true to yourself through all of it." "I had good teachers," Marco replied, squeezing his father's shoulder. As twilight deepened and festival lights illuminated the courtyard, Marco watched Edward and William Arthurs deep in conversation by the fountain, 2 generations of mentorship, now connecting to a third through him. The realization brought with it a profound sense of responsibility, not just to succeed, but to ensure that the chain remained unbroken. 5 years after that rainy morning interview, Marco found himself back in Chicago on a similarly stormy day. Spring thunderstorms lashed against the windows of Granger Tower as he reviewed quarterly reports in his corner office, a space 3 floors below Edward's, with its own impressive view of Lake Michigan. The Emerging Markets Initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations, now operating in 12 countries across Asia and Africa. Its success had transformed Granger & Wells itself, attracting socially conscious investors and establishing the firm as a pioneer in impact-focused finance. What had begun as an experimental program was now a core business division generating both financial returns and measurable social impact. Marco's phone buzzed with a message from Sophie, Edward's ever-efficient assistant. "Edward asks if you can join the executive committee interview at 2 p.m. Unexpected opening." Marco checked his calendar. He had been scheduled to video conference with the Lagos team, but that could be rescheduled. He texted back his confirmation and returned to his reports, making notes for the upcoming board presentation. At precisely 1:58 p.m., Marco entered the executive floor, nodding to Eleanor, who had replaced Vivian as receptionist years ago. "They're in boardroom 3, she informed him. "The candidate just arrived. Cutting it, rather." "Close?" Marco thanked her and made his way down the hallway, wondering why Edward had requested his presence at an executive interview. As vice president of global initiatives, Marco had his own hiring authority and rarely participated in other divisions' recruitment. When he entered the boardroom, he found several members of the executive committee seated around the table, with Edward at the head. They were engaged in tense conversation, their expressions suggesting disapproval. "He's 20 minutes late," James Calloway was saying, his tone crisp with displeasure. "And according to reception, he arrived looking rather disheveled." "The storm is quite severe," someone else offered. "Perhaps there were transportation issues." Calloway shook his head. "That's precisely why. Professionals build in extra time. Punctuality reflects planning and respect." Marco experienced an odd sense of déjà vu as he took a seat beside Edward, who acknowledged him with a subtle nod, but remained silent, allowing the conversation to continue. "Should we even proceed with the interview?" another executive asked. "Being this late to an executive committee meeting doesn't inspire confidence." Before anyone could respond, the door opened. A young woman escorted in a man in his early 30s, his suit damp at the shoulders, his tie slightly askew. Despite his appearance, he carried himself with quiet dignity, meeting each person's gaze directly as introductions were made around the table. When the candidate was seated, Calloway, now silver-haired but no less intimidating than he had been 5 years ago, fixed him with a critical stare. "Mr. Okoro, you're late. Quite late, in fact. This doesn't create a favorable first impression." The young man, Nigerian by his accent, straightened in his chair. "I apologize for my tardiness, Mr. Calloway. There's no excuse, though there is an explanation if you wish to hear it." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Please, enlighten us." "My train was delayed due to flooding on the tracks," Mr. Okoro began. "When we were finally allowed to disembark, I tried to get a rideshare, but the storm had caused a surge in demand. I was calculating whether I could still make it on time when I noticed an elderly woman whose car had stalled in rising water beneath the Michigan Avenue underpass." Marco felt a jolt of recognition. He glanced at Edward and saw the same awareness in the older man's eyes. "Several people were passing by," Mr. Okoro continued. But no one was stopping. She seemed distressed, and the water was rising quickly. I couldn't simply walk away. "So you stopped to help," Edward stated rather than asked. "Yes, sir. We managed to push her car to higher ground and called a tow service for her. By then I knew I would be late, but—" He hesitated, then finished with simple conviction. "Some things are more important than punctuality." A weighted silence fell over the room. Marco watched the committee members exchange glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. Calloway's expression remained unreadable. "He's late, disheveled, soaking wet," Calloway began, his voice carrying the same disapproval it had 5 years earlier. "And you expect me to consider someone who can't even show up on time for the most important interview of his career?" The silence in the sleek conference room was deafening. Every head turned toward the drenched young man, his future slipping away before his eyes. Marco found himself rising to his feet, a calm certainty guiding his words. "He's late because he was helping someone in need," Marco said, his voice steady and clear. "And I suggest we hear him out." Edward's eyes met Marco's across the table, a silent approval passing between them. The other executives looked surprised at Marco's intervention, but no one objected. "Mr. Santos makes a valid point," Edward said. "Character reveals itself in the choices we make when we believe no one who matters is watching." He turned to the candidate. "Mr. Okoro, we were reviewing your proposal for expanding our African initiatives before you arrived. Perhaps you could walk us through your thinking." As Mr. Okoro gathered his thoughts, Marco observed him with keen interest. The young man's resume had been impressive. Graduate degrees from Lagos Business School and Oxford, innovative work with community banking systems in the West Africa, publications on mobile payment solutions for rural areas. But it was the unexpected choice he had made today that truly captured Marco's attention. For the next hour, Mr. Okoro presented his ideas with clarity and passion, answering challenging questions with thoughtful precision. By the time the interview concluded, the initial skepticism had given way to genuine engagement, with several committee members taking extensive notes. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Okoro," Edward said as the meeting ended. "We'll be in touch very soon. Ms. Hartman will show you out." When only the committee members remained, Calloway was the first to speak. "Well, his credentials are certainly in order, and his presentation was compelling, but the lateness concerns me. In our position, reliability is essential." "James," Marco interjected gently, "5 years ago I arrived for my interview soaking wet and 20 minutes late because I stopped to help someone change a tire in the rain. That someone turned out to be Edward, though I didn't know it at the time." He smiled at the memory. "You were ready to dismiss me without a hearing." Calloway had the grace to look slightly abashed. "That was a unique circumstance." "Perhaps," Edward said, "or perhaps it's a pattern worth recognizing. William Arthurs gave me my chance when I was late to our meeting because I stopped to help a woman who collapsed at a bus stop. William himself had been helped by a stranger during a snowstorm years earlier." He looked around the table. "What Mr. Okoro did today speaks volumes about his character, and character in the end matters more than punctuality." The committee voted unanimously to offer Mr. Okoro the position of Regional Director for West African Initiatives, reporting directly to Marco. Later, as Marco and Edward rode the elevator down to the lobby together, Edward broke their companionable silence. "You handled that well today." Stepping in for him, seeing beyond the surface, "I had a good example to follow," Marco replied. Edward smiled. "The circle continues, from William to me, from me to you, from you to Mr. Okoro. Who knows how far it will extend?" As they reached the lobby, the storm outside had begun to subside, rays of sunshine breaking through the clouds. They paused at the large windows overlooking the Chicago River, watching as the city emerged, glistening from the downpour. "Do you ever wonder," Marco asked, "what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that day, if I'd just kept running to make my interview?" Edward considered the question. "You would have arrived on time, impressed James with your punctuality, and probably still gotten the job based on your qualifications. But would you have built what you've built these past 5 years? Would you have understood what truly matters in business and in life?" He shook his head. "Some lessons can only be learned through choices that seem costly in the moment, but prove invaluable in time." Marco nodded, thinking of all that had unfolded from that single decision in the rain, the Manila hub, the initiative's expansion, the lives changed across multiple countries, and his own. Journey from anxious immigrant to confident leader. The storms don't block your path, he said, echoing words his father had often repeated. They reveal it. Edward clasped his shoulder with paternal affection. Precisely. Now, I believe you have a call to make to our newest team member. As Edward departed, Marco remained by the window a moment longer, watching people hurry through the clearing. Whether, each carrying their own hopes and burdens, each making choices that might seem small but could ripple outward in ways they couldn't imagine. His phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. Mr. Okoro's contact information attached. Edward says to tell him the good news personally. Marco smiled and headed back to the elevator, ready to continue the circle, to extend to another the same. Opportunity that had been given to him when he needed it most. Some chances were earned through credentials, others were earned in the quiet moments when no one was looking. In a world that judged fast, kindness still opened doors that resumes couldn't. And the storms, they didn't block your path, they revealed it.